The divorce papers lay between us on our granite kitchen counter like a loaded gun. Brandon stood there in his tailored suit, arms crossed, waiting. 10 years of marriage reduced to 28 pages of legal jargon. I'm Rosalie, and this is the moment my husband decided to blame me for his own failures. It's been 3 years of trying, he said, his voice carrying that familiar executive tone he used in boardroom meetings. We need to face reality. My fingers traced the edge of the papers, fighting the urge to crumple them into a ball and throw them in his perfect face. Reality? Which reality would that be, Brandon? The one where I'm somehow defective? He shifted his weight, jaw tightening. This isn't about blame, Rose. We both want different things now. I need a family, I finished for him. Because apparently, I'm the reason we don't have one. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too warm. The morning sun streaming through our designer windows seemed to mock the perfection we'd cultivated in this house. Every surface gleamed, every item carefully chosen and placed. A showcase home for a showcase marriage. I've already moved most of my things to the new apartment, he said, checking his watch. The movers will come for the rest next week. Of course he had. Brandon Turner never left anything to chance. He probably had this planned for months, waiting for the perfect moment to blindside me. When did you stop loving me? The question slipped out before I could stop it. His expression flickered, guilt maybe? Or just annoyance at having to deal with emotional messiness. That's not fair, Rose. Sometimes things just don't work out. I laughed, a harsh sound that surprised us both. Fair? You want to talk about fair? 10 years, Brandon. 10 years of my life dedicated to building your perfect little world. And now you're throwing me away because I can't give you children. He straightened his tie, a nervous habit I used to find endearing. My lawyer will contact yours. I'm being more than generous with the settlement. How considerate of you. I picked up the papers, letting them dangle from my fingertips like something contaminated. Does your new apartment have space for all your lies? Or are you keeping those here with me? His phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then back at me. I need to go. There's a meeting at 9. Of course there is. I watched him head for the door, this stranger wearing my husband's face. Brandon. He paused, hand on the doorknob. When you find someone new, and we both know you will, I hope she gives you everything you want. The words tasted like poison. Every single thing you deserve. The door clicked shut behind him, and I stood alone in our perfect kitchen, holding the death certificate of our marriage. The house's silence pressed against my ears like cotton wool, broken only by the steady tick of the designer wall clock. Another wedding anniversary gift, now marking time in a life I no longer recognized. I walked to the wine fridge, pulled out the bottle of Chateau Margaux we'd been saving for our 10th anniversary, and poured myself a glass. The rich burgundy liquid swirled in the crystal, catching the morning light. 3 months until that milestone we'd never reach. My phone lit up with a text from Maya, my best friend. Just heard. Coming over with emergency supplies. Don't do anything stupid until I get there. I took a long sip of wine, savoring its complexity. Brandon had always been so proud of his wine knowledge, explaining each bottle's history and proper appreciation. Another piece of the perfect life he'd constructed. What he didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn, was that I'd always preferred whiskey. The call came at 3 in the morning. Maya's number flashing on my phone screen jolted me awake, but it wasn't her voice I heard. It was a police officer, speaking in that carefully measured tone they must practice for delivering life-changing news. 3 hours later, I sat in the emergency room, staring at Evan's small form curled up in the hospital bed. 9 years old and now an orphan. Maya and David, gone in an instant on a rain-slicked highway. The doctor had given him something to help him sleep, but his face was still streaked with dried tears. Mrs. Turner? A social worker appeared at my side, clipboard in hand. We need to discuss temporary guardianship arrangements. I tore my eyes away from Evan. I'm his godmother. Maya and David named me in their will. Yes, we've confirmed that. She hesitated. But given your current situation, my divorce. The word still felt foreign on my tongue. That has nothing to do with my ability to care for him. She shuffled through her papers. There will need to be home visits, evaluations. Do whatever you need to do. My voice came out harder than intended. But I'm not leaving him alone in the system while you sort out the paperwork. The social worker's expression softened slightly. It won't be easy, Mrs. Turner. He's experienced severe trauma. I watched Evan's chest rise and fall with each breath. Nothing worth doing ever is. The next few days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements and legal documents. I moved Evan into my new apartment, a far cry from the showcase home I'd shared with Brandon, but it had 2 bedrooms and a tiny balcony where I'd started growing herbs. On the 4th night, the thunderstorm hit. I found Evan huddled in his closet, hands pressed against his ears. They were driving in the rain, he whispered when I crouched beside him. That's what the police said. I sat down next to him, close enough to touch but not crowding. Want to know something? Your mom used to be scared of storms too. His head lifted slightly. Really? Mom. In college, she'd climb into my bed during thunderstorms. We'd make hot chocolate and tell ghost stories until it passed. A particularly loud crack of thunder made him flinch. Without a word, I stood and held out my hand. Come on. I think we have some hot chocolate mix in the kitchen. Later, as we sat at the kitchen counter with our mugs, Evan spoke so quietly I almost missed it. Are you going to leave too? The question hit me like a physical blow. No, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere. But your husband left. Of course Maya would have told him about the divorce. She never believed in hiding things from kids. That was different. Brandon and I, we weren't meant to be a family. But you and me? We already are one. He studied his hot chocolate intently. Dad said family stays together no matter what. Your dad was right. I touched his shoulder gently. And that's exactly what we're going to do. The next morning I called in sick to Urban Threads and took Evan to the park. We sat on a bench, feeding ducks and watching joggers pass by. A young couple pushed a stroller past us, and I felt that familiar ache in my chest. The one Brandon's accusations had made so much sharper. Mrs. Turner? I turned to find Mr. Thompson, David's old friend and mentor, standing behind our bench. His silver hair was slightly disheveled, his usual impeccable suit replaced by casual weekend wear. I heard about Maya and David. His eyes moved to Evan, who had shrunk closer to my side. I've been trying to reach out, but with everything happening, it's been chaos, I admitted. We're still adjusting. He nodded, then addressed Evan directly. Your father was one of the finest engineers I ever knew. He talked about you all the time. Evan's grip on my arm loosened slightly. He did. Indeed. He was very proud of your science fair project last year. The solar-powered water purifier. For the first time in days, I saw a ghost of a smile cross Evan's face. Mr. Thompson pulled out a business card, handed it to me. When you're ready, I'd like to help. Whatever you both need. I watched him walk away, the card heavy in my hand. Behind us, the ducks squabbled over the last pieces of bread, and Evan's head gradually came to rest against my shoulder. Family stays together no matter what. Maybe David had been right after all. The manila envelope arrived without warning, mixed in with junk mail and bills. Dr. Sarah Chen's return address caught my eye, Brandon's former physician from when we were trying to conceive. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, dated 3 years ago. Medical terminology jumped out at me. Severe oligospermia, compromised motility, extremely low probability of natural conception. The room tilted sideways. I grabbed the kitchen counter, my knuckles white against the granite. All those specialists, all those treatments, all those tears, and he had known. He had known all along. My phone buzzed. A text from Brandon. Dropping by tomorrow to pick up the last of my things. 2 p.m. okay. I stared at his message until the words blurred. 3 years of watching me blame myself, 3 years of maybe next month. 3 years of him letting me carry that weight alone. The doorbell rang, startling me. Mr. Thompson stood on my doorstep, holding a laptop bag. I hope I'm not interrupting. Evan mentioned having trouble with his science project. No, please come in. I quickly tucked the medical report into a drawer. He's been struggling with the coding part. Evan emerged from his room at the sound of voices, his face lighting up at the sight of Mr. Thompson. They settled at the dining table, heads bent over the laptop as Mr. Thompson explained programming concepts I barely understood. I busied myself making coffee, trying to steady my hands, trying not to think about that damning piece of paper in the drawer. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed. "Mrs. Turner?" Mr. Thompson's voice pulled me back. "The coffee's overflowing." I looked down to find dark liquid spreading across the counter. "Sorry, I was distracted." He studied me with those keen eyes that seemed to see too much. "Evan, why don't you try implementing what we discussed? I'll help your godmother clean up." As we mopped up coffee, Mr. Thompson spoke quietly. "I knew Brandon, through business circles." "Did you?" My voice sounded strange to my own ears. "Yes. I always thought he was." He paused, choosing his words carefully, more invested in appearances than truth. I met his gaze. "What do you mean?" "Let's just say I've seen how he handles problems that don't fit his preferred narrative." He handed me a fresh paper towel. "He tends to rewrite the story to suit himself." Before I could respond, Evan called from the dining room. "I think I got it working." The evening passed with code debugging and impromptu physics lessons. After Mr. Thompson left and Evan went to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at Brandon's text message. My fingers moved across the screen. 2 p.m. is fine. There's something we need to discuss anyway. His reply came quickly. "Nothing to discuss. Just picking up my things." I thought of all the nights I'd cried myself to sleep, believing I was broken. All the times he'd held me, knowing the truth, letting me shoulder the blame. The rage that filled me was cold and precise. "Oh, but there is," I typed. "Dr. Chun sends her regards." No response. The next morning, I dropped Evan at school and went to work at Urban Threads. My colleague Sarah noticed something was off. "You okay? You've been folding that same sweater for 10 minutes. I smoothed the fabric, trying to focus. "Just thinking about karma." Deep thoughts for a Tuesday morning. "Do you believe people get what they deserve?" The words spilled out before I could stop them. She considered this while rearranging a display. "I believe truth has a way of surfacing, whether we want it to or not." At 1:55 p.m., I left work early and drove home. Brandon's sleek BMW was already parked outside. He stood by his car, phone pressed to his ear, his perfect posture betraying tension. I pulled into the driveway, remembering Mr. Thompson's words about preferred narratives. Brandon ended his call as I approached, his face a mask of practiced neutrality. "We should talk inside," I said, unlocking the door. He followed me into the kitchen. The same kitchen where he'd handed me divorce papers months ago. This time I had papers of my own to share. The school auditorium buzzed with excitement as parents filed in for the 6th grade science fair. I sat near the front, program crumpled in my hands, watching Evan adjust his display board one last time. Mr. Thompson stood beside him, offering quiet suggestions that made Evan's face light up with understanding. My phone vibrated. A text from Brandon. "Heard about your new family situation. Taking in Maya's kid? Really, Rose?" The message burned in my pocket as I watched Evan demonstrate his project. The same solar-powered water purifier he'd built with his father, now improved with Mr. Thompson's guidance. The judges nodded approvingly, making notes on their clipboards. Another buzz. "Does he know you couldn't even have kids of your own?" My fingers tightened around the phone. 3 rows ahead, I spotted Jessica, Brandon's new girlfriend, recording the presentations on her phone. She must have mentioned seeing us around town. Evan caught my eye from his station, giving me a nervous thumbs up. I forced a smile, trying to push down the acid taste of rage in my throat. The medical report sat in my bag like a loaded gun, waiting to be fired. Mr. Thompson slid into the seat beside me. "He's doing remarkably well. Thanks to you." I kept my voice steady though my hands shook. The coding additions made all the difference. "He's a brilliant boy." He paused, studying my face. "Something's troubling you." Before I could respond, the judges approached Evan's station. The head judge, a stern-looking woman in wire-rimmed glasses, began asking questions. Evan's voice carried clearly through the auditorium as he explained his project's real-world applications. "Just like his father," Mr. Thompson murmured. The judges moved on. Jessica stood up, phone still recording, and walked toward Evan's station. My heart rate spiked. I started to rise, but Mr. Thompson's hand touched my arm. Wait, he said softly. Watch. Jessica reached Evan's table, smile bright and practiced. This is such an amazing project. Would you mind if I interviewed you for my social media? I'm sure Brandon would love to see. No, thank you. Evan's voice was polite but firm. I'd rather not. Jessica's smile faltered. Oh, but surely. I said no. Evan began gathering his materials, shoulders straight. My mom, Rosalie, taught me I don't have to do things that make me uncomfortable just to make other people happy. The medical report seemed to pulse in my bag. One email to Jessica, one social media post, one carefully placed phone call. I could destroy Brandon's carefully constructed facade in minutes. The judges returned to the podium. First place in the environmental solutions category goes to Evan Mitchell for his enhanced solar water purification system. The audience applauded. Evan's face broke into a genuine smile, Maya's smile, as he accepted his ribbon. Jessica retreated to her seat, phone lowered. Mr. Thompson squeezed my arm gently. Sometimes the best revenge is living well. I watched Evan navigate the crowd of congratulating parents and teachers, his ribbon pinned proudly to his shirt. He'd chosen to take my last name when the adoption was finalized, but kept Mitchell as his middle name, a bridge between his past and future. My phone buzzed again. Brandon's message glowed on the screen. We need to talk about this situation. I thought about the medical report, about all the ways I could hurt him. Then I looked at Evan, who had chosen to be kind even when he could have been cruel. Slowly, deliberately, I deleted Brandon's messages without responding. Then I stood up and made my way through the crowd to hug my son. Mom, Evan whispered against my shoulder. Did you see? I won. I saw everything, I replied, and for the first time in months, I felt the weight of revenge lifting from my shoulders. I saw everything that matters. Behind us, Jessica slipped out of the auditorium, her phone dark. Mr. Thompson watched from his seat, a quiet smile playing at the corners of his mouth. And somewhere across town, Brandon waited for a response that would never come. The charity gala buzzed with Silicon Valley's elite, all sharp suits and practiced smiles. I adjusted my borrowed cocktail dress, feeling like an imposter until Mr. Thompson appeared at my elbow with a glass of champagne. The board members are impressed with your proposal for the Youth Coding Initiative, he said, especially the part about reaching underprivileged schools. Before I could respond, the crowd parted like water, and there was Brandon, Jessica on his arm. She wore a diamond tennis bracelet I recognized from our 10th anniversary plans, the ones we never reached. Rosalie. Brandon's voice carried that familiar boardroom confidence. Quite a surprise seeing you here. Brandon. I took a deliberate sip of champagne. I see you're still wearing your father's cufflinks, the ones that supposedly belonged to your grandfather. His smile flickered. Another lie I discovered too late, like everything else. Jessica beamed, oblivious to the tension. We have wonderful news. We're starting fertility treatments next month. Brandon's always wanted children. The champagne turned to acid in my mouth. Mr. Thompson's hand touched my back, steadying. How fascinating, I said, meeting Brandon's eyes. Which clinic did you choose? Dr. Chen's, perhaps. The color drained from his face. We should mingle with the other donors, he said quickly, steering Jessica away. That was cruel, Mr. Thompson observed quietly. Was it? My hand shook. He let me believe I was broken for 3 years. And now you have the power to break him back. He studied me carefully. The question is, what kind of person do you want to be? Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. A text from our neighbor. Evan had a panic attack during his tutoring session. He was asking for me. I turned to leave, but Brandon blocked my path. We need to talk. Now. My son needs me. He's not your son. Brandon's voice carried across the quiet space between us. Just like you'll never be anyone's real mother. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient chatter seemed to die. You want to talk about what's real, Brandon? My voice emerged surprisingly steady. Let's talk about Dr. Chen's diagnosis. The one you hid for 3 years while watching me blame myself. The one you're still hiding from Jessica. His facade cracked. You wouldn't dare. Mom. Evan's voice cut through the tension. He stood in the doorway, still in his school uniform, our neighbor hovering uncertainly behind him. "I'm sorry," she called out. "He insisted on coming to find you." I moved toward Evan, but Brandon grabbed my arm. "This conversation isn't over." "Actually, it is." Mr. Thompson's voice carried quiet authority. "Unless you'd like the board to hear about your creative accounting with the Anderson project?" Brandon's grip loosened. I pulled away, reaching Evan in 3 quick steps. His face was tear-stained, his breathing still uneven. "I had a dream about Mom and Dad," he whispered. I couldn't remember Dad's voice. I held him close, feeling his heart race against my chest. Behind us, I heard Jessica asking Brandon what I'd meant about Dr. Chun. "Let's go home," I said to Evan, but he pulled back slightly. "Can Mr. Thompson come? He knows what Dad's voice sounded like." I turned to find Mr. Thompson already collecting our coats, while Brandon led a confused-looking Jessica toward the exit. "Of course I'll come," Mr. Thompson said. "I have some videos from when your father presented at conferences. Would you like to see those?" Evan nodded, his breathing steadier now. As we left, I caught a glimpse of Brandon watching us, his perfect world beginning to unravel. I could have ended him right there, exposed every lie in front of everyone who mattered to his career. Instead, I walked away with my son and the man who'd shown us both what real strength looks like. Let Brandon's lies catch up to him on their own time. I had more important things to focus on. "Mom." Evan's voice was small. "Can we have hot chocolate when we get home?" "With extra marshmallows," I promised, leaving revenge behind like a discarded party favor. Jessica's Instagram post appeared on my phone screen at 3 a.m. Sometimes the people closest to us hide the biggest secrets. Heartbroken but stronger. #moving on #truth. I scrolled through the comments, watching Brandon's carefully constructed life implode in real time. His sister had chimed in. "I always knew something was off about your divorce from Rosalie." The triumph I'd imagined feeling never came. Instead, exhaustion settled deep in my bones as I sat in my darkened kitchen, the blue light of my phone casting shadows. A text from Brandon lit up my screen. "You ruined everything. Happy now." Before I could respond, another message arrived. "The board is reviewing the Anderson project tomorrow. Thompson's doing. You both will regret this." The threat in his words made my stomach clench. Mr. Thompson had stuck his neck out for me, recommending me for the youth coding initiative. If Brandon revealed certain creative liberties we'd taken with the budget, my phone rang Mr. Thompson's number. "The board called an emergency meeting," he said without preamble. "Brandon's making accusations." "I'll resign," I said quickly. "You shouldn't lose everything because of me." "That's not why I called." His voice softened. "Check your email." I opened my laptop, finding a new message from Brandon to the entire board. Attached were photos, surveillance shots of me and Mr. Thompson together at dinner at Evan's school events, leaving my apartment late at night. "He's painting it as a scandal," Mr. Thompson said quietly, "suggesting impropriety in your hiring." The kitchen walls seemed to close in. Evan's scholarship. The board's questioning everything now. A small sound made me turn. Evan stood in the doorway, pajama-clad and pale. "Mom? Is something wrong?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Go back to bed." But he didn't move. "I heard you crying earlier." Had I been crying? I touched my cheek, finding it wet. "I got another email," Mr. Thompson said in my ear. "Brandon's threatening to contest the adoption." The phone slipped from my fingers, clattering on the counter. Evan rushed forward, his small hand steadying me as my knees buckled. "He can't," I whispered, but Brandon's words from the gala echoed. "He's not your son." "Mom!" Evan's voice cracked. "Are they going to take me away?" I pulled him close, breathing in the scent of his shampoo. "Never. I promise." My phone buzzed again. "Brandon. Board meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. Bring your resignation letter if you want to protect Thompson's reputation and Evan's future." Evan pulled back. His face set in that determined expression that reminded me so much of Maya. "I recorded something," he said. "The day of the science fair, when Jessica came to my table." He grabbed my phone, pulled up a video. Jessica's voice came through clearly. "Brandon's so excited about starting our family. He says he's always wanted children." Then Brandon's voice in the background. "Absolutely. Nothing wrong with me. Just needed the right partner. The timestamp showed it was taken minutes before he'd confronted me at the gala. I knew he was lying, Evan said quietly. Like he lied about you. Mr. Thompson's voice came through the forgotten phone on the counter. Rosalie? Are you there? I picked up the phone with trembling hands. Can you call an emergency board meeting? Tonight. It's almost 4 in the morning. Trust me. Evan tugged my sleeve. Mom? Remember what you told me about the thunderstorm? About being brave. I looked at my son because that's what he was regardless of blood or papers, and saw Maya's strength shining through his eyes. Sometimes, I said into the phone, the storm has to get worse before it breaks. Mr. Thompson was quiet for a moment. I'll make the calls. But Rosalie. Yes. Whatever happens, you're not alone in this. I ended the call and hugged Evan tight, feeling his heart beat against mine. Brandon wanted a war? Fine. But he'd forgotten one crucial thing. I wasn't fighting just for myself anymore. Dawn was breaking as I forwarded Evan's video to the board members, saying to Jessica, sometimes karma needs a little push. The emergency board meeting buzzed with tension as Brandon paced before the conference table. His perfectly pressed suit couldn't hide the wild look in his eyes. These accusations are baseless, he said, gesturing at the surveillance photos projected on the wall. Thompson's been compromised by his personal relationship with my ex-wife. I sat between Mr. Thompson and Jessica, who'd arrived moments after receiving Evan's video. Her mascara was smeared, her knuckles white around her phone. Before we continue, Mr. Thompson said quietly, perhaps we should address the Anderson project discrepancies. Brandon's step faltered. Those numbers were approved. By you, I cut in. After you altered them. The board chairman leaned forward. What alterations? Jessica stood abruptly, her chair scraping against hardwood. I have something to say. This isn't about you, Brandon snapped. No. She turned to face him. Like your infertility wasn't about me? The treatments we've been planning, the specialists you claim to have consulted. Brandon's facade cracked. Sit down. The timestamps on your medical records, she continued. They're from when you were married to Rosalie. You knew all along. The room fell silent. Brandon's face contorted, and for a moment, I saw the scared little boy beneath the executive mask, the one who'd rather destroy others than face his own failures. You want to talk about lies? He grabbed his laptop. Let's discuss the real numbers behind Thompson's Precious Youth Coding Initiative. Brandon. Mr. Thompson's voice carried a warning. The budget she submitted? Pure fiction. Just like her qualifications to run it. I stood slowly. Play the video, Jessica. She pressed play on her phone. Brandon's voice filled the room. Nothing wrong with me. Just needed the right partner. The board members exchanged glances. Brandon lunged for the phone, but Jessica stepped back. The numbers weren't fiction, I said clearly. They were conservative. Because unlike you, I actually visited the schools. Talked to the kids. Saw what they could do with even limited resources. Like your adopted charity case? Brandon sneered. The chairman cleared his throat. About those adoption papers you mentioned contesting. Already handled, Mr. Thompson said. The board's legal team reviewed everything this morning. The adoption is ironclad. Brandon's laugh held an edge of hysteria. You're all blind. She manipulated everything, the job, the adoption, all of it. She couldn't have children of her own, so she stole someone else's. Mom didn't steal me. Everyone turned. Evan stood in the doorway, still in his school uniform, holding his science fair project. Evan, I started, but he walked straight to the board table. I chose her, he said, setting up his display. Like I chose to improve my dad's design instead of starting over. Because sometimes the best family isn't the one you're born with, it's the one you build. Brandon stared at the solar water purifier, at David's original plans visible beneath Evan's improvements. The board has heard enough, the chairman said. Brandon, we'll need your resignation by end of day. You can't. We can and we will. The Anderson project alone. But Brandon wasn't listening. He grabbed the water purifier, raising it over his head. No, Evan shouted. I moved without thinking, catching the project as Brandon released it. Something sharp sliced my palm, but I held on. The room erupted in chaos. Security appeared. Jessica turned away, shoulders shaking. Mr. Thompson helped me steady the project while Evan checked for damage. "It's okay," he whispered. "We can fix it. Together." Brandon's voice rose above the commotion. "This isn't over." But it was. I watched security escort him out, saw the board members shaking their heads, felt Mr. Thompson's steady presence beside me. "Your hand's bleeding," Evan said. I looked at my palm, at the thin red line already beginning to heal. "Some scars are worth it." The chairman approached, extending his hand. "About that youth coding initiative. We'd like to double the budget." Outside, the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the boardroom table. Sometimes karma doesn't just happen. Sometimes it needs witnesses, truth, and a 9-year-old's unwavering faith in the family he chose. The autumn wind scattered leaves across Maya's headstone as I placed fresh flowers beside it. Evan knelt, carefully arranging his latest robotics competition medal next to the bouquet. "Mom would have loved watching you compete," he said quietly. "She was there." I touched the stone's smooth surface. "Just like she's been here all along." A familiar set of footsteps crunched through fallen leaves behind us. Mr. Thompson, James now, appeared with 2 cups of hot chocolate, a tradition we'd borrowed from Maya. "Your father would be proud too," he said, handing Evan a cup. "Especially of the improvements you made to his design." Evan traced the engraved dates with his free hand. "I found something in Dad's old files yesterday. Want to see?" He pulled out a folded paper from his jacket, a letter in David's handwriting. My breath caught as I recognized the date. 3 days before the accident. "Dear Brandon," Evan read. "Thank you for your interest in investing in the water purification project. However, after reviewing your proposed changes to the design, I must decline." My hand shook as I took the letter. He knew. Dad wrote that Brandon wanted to cut corners, make it cheaper to mass produce. Evan's voice held no bitterness, only quiet understanding. He chose integrity over profit. James squeezed my shoulder. Like father, like son. A notification lit up my phone. Brandon's LinkedIn profile had been updated. Last I'd heard, he'd taken a job with a smaller firm in another state. The update showed he'd started volunteering at a youth mentoring program. "Good for him," I said, and meant it. Evan looked up, surprised. "Really? Sometimes people need to lose everything to find themselves." I thought of the woman I'd been a year ago, consumed by thoughts of revenge. And sometimes the best revenge is letting go. "Is that why you never sent Dad's letter to the board?" I smiled, remembering the day I'd chosen to shred Dr. Chen's report instead of using it as a weapon. Some truths serve no purpose except destruction. James checked his watch. "We should head back. The Foundation's Youth Coding Showcase starts in an hour." As we walked to the car, Evan hung back. "Mom? Remember when you said family is about choices?" "Of course. I made a choice too back then. The day Brandon gave you the divorce papers." He pulled something else from his jacket, a crumpled envelope, edges worn with age. "I found this in Maya's desk after everything." Inside was a medical report, Brandon's original infertility diagnosis. "Maya had known all along. She told me to give it to you if you ever needed it," Evan said. "But you didn't need it. You were stronger than that." I stared at my son, this remarkable boy who'd kept this secret, who'd understood more than any of us had given him credit for. "We should frame your medal," I said, handing the envelope back. "Next to your dad's original designs." "And the photo from the coding showcase?" His eyes sparkled with meaning. "Which one?" "The one where James is looking at you like Dad used to look at Mom." Heat crept into my cheeks as James called from the car. "We're going to be late." Evan grinned, tucking the envelope back into his jacket. Some secrets, I realized, were worth keeping. Not for revenge or power, but as reminders of the choices we make and the people we choose to become. The wind picked up, sending leaves dancing around Maya's headstone. For a moment, I could almost hear her laugh, could almost see her nodding approval at the family we'd built from broken pieces and better choices. "Ready?" James asked as we reached the car. I looked at Evan, already pulling out his project notes, then at James with his quiet strength and unwavering support. The answer came easily, tasting of truth and hot chocolate and second chances. We already are.